Hi Jazz fans, we're looking at a game between Mickey Adams with white and a guy called Batchuluun with black. Batchuluun is the #1 rated player in Mongolia, and the game was played in the World Cup in 2017. In this video we will learn a few very important concepts in the Italian defense. We will also learn about how white can formulate a strategy with a key pawn push, and we will look at a very interesting rook ending. So Mickey played e4 and Batchuluun responded with e5, and after a few moves we have reached the Italian defense, and in this position Mickey played d3. We want to use this position to examine one concept in the Italian defense, and the concept is why does white play d3 here, and why does he not aspire to play d4 in one move? For example, you could defend this pawn, which is attacked by the knight, with the rook to e1, and then play c3 with the plan to push d4. So why does white not play this plan, but instead goes for the slow-looking d3? It's a very theoretical move, but what's the reason behind this? Okay, let's have a look. After rook e1, black can castle, and if white now continues with his plan with c3 to push d4, black has the resource knight takes e4. And the pawn is protected by the rook, but because of this configuration with the Italian bishop on c4, the rook is not doing a good job defending the pawn on e4 because of the motive d5. Attacking both the bishop and the rook, and after takes, queen takes, rook e1, material is equal, but the problem is that black has developed 3 pieces, whereas white has only developed this knight, and this pawn is actually blocking the bishop and the knight. So in this position black is actually already a lot better, you can see here with the engine. Okay, so that's the reason why white always plays d3 here. Okay, so let's continue. Next concept we can learn about the Italian defense. Batchuluun played in this position d6. And similar question, why can black not be more aspirational and play d5 here? Okay, let's calculate this line. After d5, white can play e takes d, and after knight takes d, rook e1 attacks this pawn. And the problem is that this pawn is sitting in front of the king, and the pressure of this knight and this rook is another important motive. So whenever black considers playing d5, he has to be calculating, okay, what after e takes d, and this pressure on the e5 pawn. Okay, so that's the reason why black also usually plays d6 here. And black can, however, play instead castle. And if the game then continues c3, black now can play d5, because the king is out of the center. If white now plays e takes d, knight takes, white has the resource rook e1, attacking the pawn. But in this position, black, for example, can just play bishop e6. Can just play bishop e6, and there is no immediate threat in the position. The game simply continues. Okay, after d6, the game continued c3, a6 and a4. But I would briefly like to examine another concept in the Italian defense. If in this position black had castled and white continued with c3, like he did earlier in the game as well. After d6, it's very common for white in this position to play knight to d2. And let's have a look at this move. So white has the plan to play c3 and knight to d2. But why does white not simply play knight c3? What's the problem with this move? Okay, so let's have a look why this c3 plan followed by knight bd2 is usually a good idea. Okay, so the concepts that we're going to see in these moves are related to plans that black has and that white has. So an important issue is this bishop. So where does this bishop go? And the idea, one idea behind knight b to d2 is that if the bishop goes to g4, white can use this knight to play against this bishop. So let's have a look. For example, after a6, bishop b3, if now bishop to g4, this knight suddenly becomes very useful because white can play h3, the bishop retreats, and rook e1, and now the knight can go to g3 to push this bishop back. Okay, so that's one purpose of this knight on d2, because he can go to g3. Okay, another function of this knight is this square on e3. So how is that? For example, after a6, black usually wants to hold on to this bishop and creates this luft for the bishop on a7. And in this position, white can play bishop b3, and black often retreats the bishop here right away. And now the knight can go to c4. And the idea is that white now controls this e3 square with the knight, and the bishop can come here to exchange itself against the dark squared bishop. Or, for example, after b5, the knight can also occupy this square himself, and this is a very good square because it controls the squares on d5 and f5. Okay, so that's the reason why often in the Italian defense, white plays with this c3 knight to d2 plan, just because the knight can jump to c4 or to f1, and that's very useful in the position. And c3 in and by itself also serves the function to make this knight look a bit bad because it takes away these squares, and of course to prepare d4 maybe at some point, or b4 at some point. So that makes this setup very useful for white. Okay, with this in mind, let's return to the game. Black played d6, the game continued c3, again this very useful move as we now see, a6 creating luft for the bishop. And now in this position white could again play knight b to d2, but black has not castled yet, and white plays a4. And the idea is to grab space on the queen side, and we will see how this motive will become important later in the game. Black castled, and after h3, playing against this bishop, the bishop now doesn't have the square anymore, h6, rook e1, bishop a7, now knight b to d2. White is boxing in this bishop a little bit and has this space here on the queen side. And in this particular position, let's have a last look at some of the concepts in the Italian defense before we move on to the middle game and the end game. What are some plans for black in this position? There are three typical plans. Okay, black plans evolve a lot around what to do with this bishop. This knight is okay, it can maybe at some point go here and be useful on the king side. This knight is okay, this bishop is really good, but the bishop on c4 is really white's most important piece, and the bishop on c8 is white's worst piece. So a lot of the plans evolve around exchanging these bishops. And the first, most straightforward way to do that is to play the bishop to e6 and to go into a game where black has this black had this interesting pawn structure, and these pawns can become weak, but it also opens up this diagonal for the rook, maybe controls the center a little bit, but maybe also makes the king a bit weak. Okay, so interesting position. It's a theory move, so it's possible to play this position, but more often black plays rook e8 to prepare bishop to e6, and for example after knight f1, rerouting the knight to a more useful square, black now plays bishop to e6, and after exchanging the rook here, now a question of the game becomes, is the rook here good or bad? You know, maybe it's bad because it can be attacked at some point, maybe it's good because it can actually be quite active here. Okay, and the third plan is something totally different. ignoring this bishop for now and playing knight to h5. And the idea is to bring the knight to the f4 move, potentially bring the queen in as well, and then leaving the question open what happens with this bishop. Maybe there will be a king attack and the bishop exchanges itself on h3 or sacrifices itself on h3. Okay, so these are the plans for black in the position. Let's go back to the game. Mickey played knight f1. The game continued queen to f6, again eyeing the square. And after bishop e3, white is playing against the bishop on a7, and this exchange, the game continued like this. By the way, why would knight knight f4 in this position not be such a good idea? Black was preparing this with queen f6. Okay, in this position, white can simply exchange. And in this particular position, this pawn can potentially be weak, and white has potentially a good center. So the most direct continuation could be queen d2. And if black wants to hold on to this pawn and plays g5, then white can simply start opening up the position and play against the white squares of the king. And if black instead plays queen to f6 to protect the pawn, then white has plans to attack this queen. And you know, this pawn is a little bit weak here, and black has to find ways in the short term to defend the pawn, and in the long term white has the advantage of the center control and an attack on the king, because look, the knights can be brought into the attack quickly, and the bishop is already here, and the queen can be brought in as well. So it's not a position you want to have with black positionally. So that's why knight f4 in this position is also quite objectively not a good move. See, white, even the engine says that white has a little advantage here already. Okay, the game continued queen f6, bishop e3, and after this exchange we have reached this position. White has now these two good knights and this bishop, and black, you know, black's pieces are already a little bit worse because, well, it's not clear what this queen is doing here. The question of this bishop is not answered. So the game continued now, knight f4, and king h2 protects the h3 pawn. After bishop d7, white grabs more space, and we want to fast forward to this position here. So black was wanting to solve the question about this bishop by exchanging it. The old motive that we have seen before, very typical motive in the Italian defense. White wants to exchange the dark squared bishop, black wants to exchange the light squared bishop. Okay, in this position, white played g3 and allowed this exchange. So what do you think? How should white retake here? Okay, the most natural move would be to take with the knight, not to ruin the pawn structure, but what's the problem with this move? Problem with this move simply is that black gets counterplay. After d5, e takes, knight takes, black has suddenly solved his problems. The pieces get very active, the queen has a purpose here, the knights are strong in the center, and black has the resource of this important pawn push here. And black's king is actually pretty weak now after all this g3. All the light squares have become weak and can be attacked. So instead, and this is what Mickey played as well, it's better to play d takes c, because this pawn can really not be attacked so easily. And with the pawn on c4, any pawn push d6 to d5 becomes immediately useless. So actually, white has created a position where both the pawn push on b7 is not possible and the pawn push on d6 is not possible. After knight e6, b4, let's have a look at this position. What resource has white created in this position? Okay, white has created the resource of space advantage. Okay, why is this so important? What does space advantage mean? So let's have a look. In this position, where can this knight go? There's actually no square for the knight without it blocking other pieces. And even if the knight reroutes to here. There are no squares for the knight here neither. Okay, where can this knight go? There's not many squares for this knight either. And these rooks, what purpose do they have and how can they be rerouted to better purposes? It's very unclear. Because the black's position is already a bit cramped, black cannot reroute his pieces so easily. Okay, so black's best move, the best move that black could find was to play knight e7. But look, what are these pieces doing now? And on the other hand, what can white play? White played rook a2, and the rook, is improved. White has improved his position because the rook here is now ready to swing over. The rook protects the pawn. The rook could maybe go to d2 to create some pressure here. So because of the space advantage, it's much easier for white to bring his pieces into better positions, and it's very hard for black to put his pieces in better positions. So black played rook a to d8, and now we have reached a key position in the game. Imagine you're white, you have the space advantage, you have the better pieces. How to take advantage of this now? Let's analyze this position and what should be white's strategy. Okay. White's strategy, where does it come from? It comes from the position of the pieces, it comes from the position of the opponent's piece, it comes from the pawn structure. And one idea is to push this pawn here to c5. Exchange the pawn against the d6 pawn, and then have a weakness here. So the strategy is driven a lot about how can I create weaknesses in black's position. In this position, white can say, I have the better pieces, I have the space advantage, black's pieces cannot move anywhere, so how do I proceed? And a way to proceed is to ask yourself, how can I create weaknesses? And so the key idea in this position is to push the pawn forward to c5 and create a weakness here on d6, this sort of minority attack idea. And what are problems behind this? Okay, so one problem obviously is that if this pawn exchanges itself on c5, the queen is being attacked. So one idea surely related to playing c5 is to move the rook here to d2 to create pressure on the weakness later, but also to protect the queen. Okay. Another question is, what about this knight? This knight currently controls the square on c5. So maybe one idea to implement this strategy is, okay, what to do about this knight? Ideally, I would love to exchange this knight against one of my pieces. Okay, and then let's imagine a position where I have created a weakness here on d6. I want black's pieces to be as bad as possible. So one kind of thing to consider in the position as well is, this knight is very useful. I want this knight to stay here, because if there's a weakness here on d6, black has to coordinate his pieces to protect this weakness, and this knight is very useful in blocking the queen to come over, and maybe the knight moves to c8, but here it will be very passive forever. So I want to exchange this knight. I want to make sure this knight stays where it is. I want to take control of the d file, and I want to push c5. Okay, so these are some considerations. And now let's have a look at what Mickey played. Mickey played h5. And this move serves a number of purposes. The one purpose marked here in blue is that it invites the knight to move to g5 and exchange itself for this knight. Black is in a very cramped position, and it's already hard for him to find moves, and it's very inviting to give this square to black and kind of invite black to exchange some pieces. If black's position is cramped and he has no weaknesses, black wants to play to exchange pieces and then be left with an endgame that's better because he has no weaknesses. So h5 is very interesting because it gives black this opportunity, and it's psychologically very difficult not to take it. But if black takes this, white has actually already achieved one goal, to exchange this knight. So now this actually helps white to continue with his plan. Okay, so that's a very interesting feature of this move. Second feature of this move is that it takes away the square on g6 and basically says, okay, dear knight here on e7, you have one less square to go and you're going to stay put where you are. So in this way, this move is contributing to two goals in white's strategy. And indeed, the game continued knight to g5, knight g6, queen g5. Okay, so how does this c5 push look like right now? It already looks much better because the knight here on e6 is gone. Okay, but before pushing, Mickey played rook to d2. Just, of course, making sure that it works tactically. If he played right now, of course, black would win because of this discovered attack on the queen. So rook to d2 is the second move that prepares the c5 push. And by the way, black can do nothing against this. You know, black in this position could play b6 to prevent this push. But in this position, white simply exchanges and reaches the goal all the same. Black has a weakness here on d6. Okay, so there's not really much that black can do against it. And you know, if black played knight to c8 to protect his pawn, then white can take advantage of the fact that this knight is so bad here and doesn't have anywhere to go. So white can simply now continue his play and maybe attack the king. So this passive knight here gives white another resource. So for example, immediately white has access to this square here because this knight is not protecting it anymore. And then the knight can simply help white here to achieve other goals. For example, at some point pushing f4, opening the position, and bringing the queen maybe in and the rooks, and have some good attack on the king. Okay, in this position it's already very hard, and black chooses an active move, f5, trying to make some use of this knight, because the knight helps with this push, and maybe also inviting white to create some weaknesses on his own. The game continued e takes f, knight takes f, and black has achieved the goal, sort of. He has now a little bit more active knight. Okay, so let's have a look at this position. What should be white's next move? White still has a strategy of creating some weaknesses with c5. So what happens if white plays c5 right away? Well, then black can take, and after takes, the queen is attacked. And what has white achieved really? There's not a weakness. So the problem is that c5 can be met by d takes c. And what's the problem? It's the queen. So white played queen to g4. Now this rook here, after an exchange of queens, is not protected by the queen anymore. And the move knight takes e3 does not work because white could now exchange. And white has achieved what he wanted, a weakness here on g5 and potentially a second weakness after this pawn push. Okay, so that's why black is kind of forced to exchange the queens. And in this position, the rook is now not defended by the queen anymore. There is no queen in the way of the d file anymore. And also, have a look at this knight. Is this knight having a good position or a bad position? Okay, this knight here is actually, so this operation not only served to exchange the queens, but this knight is actually very useful here as well, because it attacks the e4-5 pawn. And that's very useful because if at some point c5 happens, and this pawn moves forward or exchanges here, then white can attack this pawn with the knight and the rook. So for example, in this position, white is already threatening c5. And indeed, after king f7, bringing the king into the action a little bit, white now played c5. And in this position, all the pieces, the two rooks, the knight, they all coordinate really well with this c5 push. So Mickey has finally, by exchanging the pieces and operations, reached an ideal position to play c5. And why is that? Okay, let's just have a look at a few moves. If black, for example, wants to double the rooks on the e file, what can white play? White can simply take on e5, because after takes, this rook was not protected anymore. Okay, so black cannot play that. What about the other rook? What if black wanted to exchange rooks, to double rooks on the d file? In this position, white has knight takes e5, and you see how useful this knight is. D takes, check. Okay, can the king move somewhere? What if the king moves to e6, trying to get into the action? Well, in this position, white can take, and play f4. And the pawn cannot take because the king is behind it, so if the king moves back, we can have this exchange and win a pawn as well with active pieces, and the game is won. Okay, so what can black do? Can black maybe push the pawns forward? So what happens after d5? Well, in this position, white has check and f4, and the position is lost. White's a pawn up and the knight is super active. Okay, it might have been actually a good option to push the other pawn, because in this position, if white now plays against the d6 pawn, a position like this could arise. And yes, there's this pawn here on e4, which is blocked and doesn't go anywhere, and it can be weak, and it ties black's pieces to its defense. And probably in the long term, this will help white to win, but it's just one weakness. And, you know, the position is kind of unclear, so this might have been maybe a good option. Black instead chose g6, trying to get some counterplay and trying to highlight the weakness of this pawn potentially. White simply took this pawn and then exchanged the pawn on d6. And the idea is that after rook takes, white can either immediately exchange the rooks, but the more direct way would even be to take the rook here. And if rook takes d2, we can take this rook. And if this rook takes, we have a check, and the knight drops back to defend the rook, or even give other checks and continue tactically. For example, in this position, if the king comes, we can now exchange the rooks and enter a knight ending with a pawn up. Okay, so that's why in this position black plays c takes d, and white has achieved his strategic goal. There is now a weakness on d6, and there's also a weakness on h6. Okay, so this is why white has now, all of what white has achieved with all these operations before is now an ending where black has two weaknesses, and really it's a sort of ending where white can only play for, where only white can play for a win, and black will be happy to hold a draw. It's exactly what a player like Mickey Adams wants to have against a slightly weaker player, a super safe ending with good winning chances. Okay, so with this entire strategy that we have seen here, you know, look at this position. White has a space advantage and black has no weaknesses. And, you know, white has done all these strategic operations, but basically following his strategy all along. White now has reached this ending where it's a rook ending with two weaknesses, which is a super safe ending for white. Very interesting. Okay, the game continued knight e3. White is happy to exchange knights here, and black is happy as well, because otherwise the knight gets the super active square. And again, we have a rook ending with two weaknesses. Okay, so black realizes, okay, I'm worse here, and basically positions his rooks to defend the weaknesses. And white makes sure there's no counterplay. Okay, after rook c8, rook e4, king f5, what is the problem? What is the problem in this position? Or maybe already here, what's the problem for white? Why is this not easily won? The problem is that white cannot so easily attack these weaknesses, and black can defend these weaknesses very easily. So white still has to work a lot to really make these weaknesses count. And let's not forget, if white wins one of these pawns, then white is simply up one pawn. It still has to win a rook ending. Okay, so that highlights why white has a very safe ending, but it's also very hard to win. And let's have a look how Mickey does that. Again, he plays c4, blocking this weakness. Black attacks the c4 pawn, but white simply moves the rook forward to a more active square, defending this pawn, and maybe also moving over to attack this weakness. King f5 tries to activate the king. Okay, rook moves over. The rook is protected here by the pawn and defends this pawn and attacks this pawn permanently. Okay, good square for the rook. Rook c6, black really says, okay, I'm going to defend here. This pawn, I'm going to defend it. I'm not going to do any active operations, but I'm defending. Show me how you can make progress. White wants to make progress by moving the king in. Black improves his position a little bit. The rook is better here even than on the other square. King f3, king e6. Okay, again, how can white attack both weaknesses at the same time? Very hard to see. Black doesn't have any active plans, but how does white make progress? Okay, white shows rook c2 here, but it's unclear really what this move does. Maybe it's just a move that asks black, okay, black, make a move. Show me that you don't weaken yourself further. Okay, black plays rook f6, king e3, because after king to e4, the king is not doing much here and blocks the way for this rook a little bit. So Mickey played king e3, a very flexible move. And now black played d5. So black is very interesting how black deals with this position. Black says, okay, I got a weakness here, and how can I get rid of this weakness? I can get rid of the weakness by pushing the pawn forward. The rook here is protected by the pawn. I got an active king. So let me give a check here and get this rook to an active square and then play e5. Okay, and if in this position where white cannot take, because the king would come in and the weakness is away, and maybe some rooks exchange, and then it's actually already a dead draw ending. So white is looking for some chances to keep the position open and play f3. And what do you think about the position that arises after d takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes? What do you think of this position? Do you prefer white or black? Okay, the analysis is probably very clear. Black has three weaknesses. There is a weakness here on b7, on e5, and on h6. And how could white in this position play to win? So let's have a look at some moves. What if black moves the king? Let's say to d7. In this position, white can immediately attack the pawn on e5, and if the king moves back to defend, move the king forward, and in the next move, the rook will take this pawn. And there's very little that black can do against it. If the rook comes in to defend, white can simply play rook d5, and the king has to move, and then white will win this pawn. Okay, so the king kind of cannot move back. Okay, so because then white moves forward to attack the e5 pawn. What if the king moves forward, attacking this rook? Well, then very similar things happen. Rook to c5 gives a check, and we have reached the same position. Okay, so the king can also not move forward. What if the king stays where it is and the rook does something, what can the rook do? Maybe the rook can attack this pawn, but in this position white can simply play g4. Rook has nothing better to move back, and then play b5. So this happens when the king doesn't move at all. White has this b5 move, and what can black do? If black doesn't do anything, let's say the rook moves here, then white takes, and after takes has this check and wins a lot of pawns. Okay, so black has to basically take here, and this allows rook to b5, and there's not really much that black can do to not to get in disadvantage here. If king d6, moving the king in, the rook takes, and in this position, if black now defends with the pawn on b7 with the king, the rook simply takes and wins a pawn. And if black defends with the rook, white has rook b6 and attacks the other pawn. So that's a problem when you have so many weaknesses. Okay, so in this position we looked at the king moving back, but then we saw that the rook attacks the e5 pawn. We looked at the king moving forward, then the same happens just with check. We looked at the rook doing something, but that allows white to do the b5 push. So the other move that black can do is to move the king to d6, being ready to defend against the b5 move, and otherwise not allowing white to attack the pawn on e5. So if now rook attacks, then rook to g6, king e4, rook takes, will probably also be a draw, or would be a draw. So king d6, is making sure that this rook to c5 move doesn't happen. Okay, so if rook to c5, we have this counterattack, and if the king moves forward, we win this pawn. And if g4, the king doesn't move forward, but instead g4, then rook f6 is ready to give a check here if the king moves forward, and otherwise win this pawn as well. So rook d6 allows to stop the rook c5 plan, and it also allows to stop the b5 plan, because in this position the king is ready to move forward. Okay, so very good move. You could find this move with black by eliminating other moves. And now white has the very strong move rook to c5. And rook to c5 basically keeps all the plans in the air, but introduces also the plane rook h2 to attack the h6 pawn. So in this position, white can swing the rook very easily back to c5, attacking the e5 pawn, can move the rook to b2 to support the b5 push, and move the rook to h2 to attack the h6 pawn. Very strong move. Okay, and how do you find a move like this? It's like by just calculating some lines and finding some plans for black. Okay, let's have a look what black can play here. If black pushes the pawn forward, so that if rook h6, black can play rook h6, then white simply has rook h4 and g4. And the problem is with this defensive strategy of moving the pawn forward and the rook behind it, that the king is too far away. The rook is not protected and cannot be protected, so by doing this push here to g4, I'm effectively pinning the pawn against the unprotected rook, and the only thing that black can do is to push this pawn forward, but I'm stopping this with rook h5. Okay, so this defensive strategy doesn't work because of rook h5 and g4. Okay, very interesting endgame trick. Okay, so what if I move the king forward? Attack. Then we have the old plan rook c5, the king has to move back, and rook e4 wins the e5 pawn. Okay, so that doesn't work. We see that a lot of the considerations we had in the variation before don't work. And what if black goes on and attacks the pawn on g3? Well, then we can just move this pawn forward if the rook goes back. Now we go to the b5 push plan, because after if the king moves forward to stop this, we can move in with our king. And if king d5, we can just continue the push, and black's position collapses, both because of the b6 plan and because of the attack on the e5 pawn. So if black doesn't do anything, like attacking this pawn and then moving the rook backwards, then white has this b2 plan. Okay, so and what can black do? Well, black cannot do anything anymore. After rook c2, the position is lost. None of the plans work, and well, maybe the position is not lost, but white will win a pawn in the end. And then white, once white, and in many of these variations, white, can also win other pawns. So if one pawn is won, white can go on and try to win the other pawn. And so this is how white can make progress. And it's a very difficult game to play for black. Okay, so that's not what happened in the game, but let's keep all these ideas that we've seen in our mind. And in this position, black did not exchange here and go into this ending with the three weaknesses. But black instead decided to play rook to g6, attacking a weakness of white's. And the game continued king f2, protecting this weakness, because after g4, black has rook c4 because the coordination is stopped, and after takes, these pawns here prevent the king from getting closer, so the king has to go this way to stop, but then the black king is ready to come in, and now suddenly black has a passed pawn here, and the rook is not there to help, so pushing the pawn forward in this position doesn't work. And the same goes true for moving the rook back. The same motives apply. So after this move, white has to play the king back. And now black played takes and entered this endgame. And what is the big difference in this position compared to the position that we saw before? What's the difference in this position? Well, the difference is that black has 2 tempi more. The white king is still in the back, and black can bring the king to the d5 square, and that makes all the difference. Because black now has an important resource, and the resource is king activity. So the only problem with king d5 was that in the variations before we always had this check, and the king had to move backward to king d6, and then remember the king could come in and this pawn falls. But because the white king is back here on f2, the black king can move forward. And now this king is even more active, and black can draw easily by simply pushing the pawns and exchanging them for white pawns, and then the game is dead drawn. So the whole point is that black here has the resource of king activity. And think about you were playing in this game. What move would you play with black? Would you not play d takes and enter this position? Maybe you wouldn't, maybe you would. But this position is much harder to play, right? Because of the analysis that we have seen. So playing rook g6 here, forcing the king back and then exchanging, makes all the difference in this game, because this is really drawn very easily. The king is active, and the game continued rook c7, attacking this pawn, but the pawn can now move forward, is protected by the rook, and if in this position takes, white hasn't made any progress, and instead white played g4, making sure that the king can move back again, because now this pawn is protected by the f3 pawn. But then black simply forces matters by this exchange, and then forces matters by pushing e4. And if white were to exchange here, the game is immediately dead drawn. So white tries to maintain some tension in the position by playing king e3, but black simply exchanges the pawn. You see, thanks to the king activity, as we have said, black can follow the plan of exchanging pawns. And now this position is dead drawn. There's no, resource for white anymore to play for win. The game still continued a few moves. But again, black simply exchanges pieces. And in this position here, both sides have a passed pawn. But both rooks can also stop the other pawns. Okay, so in this position, the black king is approaching to protect the pawn, at which point the rook would be free. And now the pawn advances, and the rook can go immediately to g1. White has to follow to protect the pawn. And now black is protecting his own pawn, and we have reached a sort of Philidor type position where black can simply give checks, and the only way that that white can exchange the checks is by moving in front of the pawn, which then blocks the pawn, and white cannot reach a sort of Lucena type of position because black would simply push his own pawn. So the rook is busy making sure that this doesn't happen, and the position is dead drawn. Okay, that was a little bit of a longer video. We looked at some ideas in the Italian defense. We then looked at, so let me just highlight the key position here to review. We looked at, for example, the interesting plans with the d2 knight. We look at why this plan with c3 and rook e1 doesn't work. We look at why the plan with d5 doesn't work. We also saw how white can play against the bishop g4 move. We looked at what plans black has in this position. We also looked at this position where white develops a strategy with the c5 push, and how Mickey Adams went about doing this. And then we looked at the rook ending, where white has created two weaknesses and a very safe ending for him. But we also saw that why in this position black can very easily draw by playing rook g6 rather than entering an exchange and reach this position. And we learned a lot about typical plans in a rook ending where the other side has weaknesses and the stronger side can attack those weaknesses. And we have seen what difference the king activity makes in a position like this. Because the king activity again allows black to exchange its weaknesses and enter a drawn ending. Okay, in this way, I hope you learned a lot. I hope to see you next time again, and thanks for watching.